Hi, Founder fans. Jason here, and today's founder is John Dickinson, specifically what he was doing at the Constitutional Convention. And to help us learn about Dickinson, who better than let's welcome back Dr. Jane Calvert. Dr. Jane, thank you so much for returning here.
Well, thanks for having me again.
Absolutely. So we've discussed Dickinson a few times at this point, and you can see the old videos for those. But today we're talking about the Constitutional Convention, and I mentioned before we start off, he was the one who wrote the Articles of Confederation. So did he also understand, like everyone else seemed to, that change was needed to the Articles?
Well, he wrote the first draft of the Articles of Confederation, and um, that was not at all what was actually implemented. So pretty much everything he wanted, like some major features of the Articles of Confederation, um, were just all excised, and he did not get what he wanted. And so he was dissatisfied with them, I think, from the beginning, and he was one of the people who believed that change was absolutely necessary. And so yeah, and in fact, the lead up, before the federal convention was the Annapolis Convention, and that took place in September 1786. And he was elected the president or the chairman of the Annapolis Convention. And they realized that there weren't enough delegates. Only I think something like 5 states sent delegates, and so they didn't have enough people to really do anything. And instead, they just made a report. And the report basically said, look, we need to figure out some stuff with trade, and we can't really do anything, but we think that there should be a convention. And so actually, the letter that was read before Congress stating that there needed to be a federal convention, that was, Dickinson wrote that letter.
Right, because
So, and they knew that.
Dickinson was at the Annapolis Convention.
He was the president of
Right,
it,
one
the
of
chairman.
only a handful of states that actually showed up was Pennsylvania.
Right. And so anyway, so yeah, that letter to Congress that said we need a convention. Let's have it in May. That was his letter, and so that was read in February, and then come May, the federal convention started. So now Dickinson, like a lot of people, wanted didn't necessarily want to sort of toss out everything and start over. In fact, they didn't have a mandate to do that. That was, they sort of fudged that a little bit. And so he, in keeping with their mandate, he wanted to just revise the articles, but obviously it went in a different direction. But so, a lot of people don't realize the major role that Dickinson played. And, pretty much James Madison gets kind of like all the credit. And one reason for that, I mean, certainly, he did contribute things, but really, he was the one who took the most extensive notes. And then over the years after the convention, he went back and revised the notes and tinkered with them. And so he gets maybe a little bit more credit than he is due. And, he certainly didn't write it. He certainly, I don't know, the whole business of like, father of the Constitution, I just don't really subscribe to that.
I'm on your team with
And
that. I'm sorry, Madison fans. He wrote
yeah,
he wrote it in the initial draft, but was it Randolph presented it, and then 3 months later wouldn't sign the final document. So it was that much different from his original notes.
right. So anyway, it's just interesting, to look at someone who is not Madison, and look, like nobody got everything that he wanted. I mean, everyone, people were making suggestions, and everyone had different ideas. The key thing about the federal convention was, the sense of compromise that they entered into, and that they worked it out. There were very strong ideas about what should be and what shouldn't be, and lots of disagreement, but they were civil and they worked it out. And so we kind of like to talk about two big compromises in the convention, and compromise can be understood as a good thing or a bad thing. And the good sense of compromise was when they worked out the problem of representation. And so the problem with representation, as far as people of this era were concerned was that it was the problem of imperium in imperio. And what that means is that they didn't believe that there could be two sovereignties in one state. And so under the British Constitution, that was sort of the big problem leading up to the revolution, was that they were saying, like, hey, look, Parliament, you can't tax us for a revenue. We can only, be taxed by our own local legislatures. And everyone said, oh, no, that's not possible, because you can't have a sovereignty within a sovereignty, a state within a state. But Dickinson had been actually thinking about this literally for decades before the Federal Convention. He was the person who was arguing in the farmers' letters that that only the local legislature should be able to tax the people for the revenue. So he was effectively arguing, this state within a state, which everyone kind of went like, that how can that be? And so he'd been thinking about this for a long time, and so actually, when we get to this compromise, or this on representation, we all know about the so-called Connecticut Compromise, but that's a misnomer. Dickinson was the first person to propose what became the Connecticut Compromise. So he said that one branch ought to represent the states, and the other branch ought to represent the people, and one of those branches ought to be equal representation. Because so he was in a unique position of all the framers. He was the only person who had extensive experience in one of the smallest states, Delaware, and one of the largest states, Pennsylvania. So he had served in the legislatures of both. He had represented both of them in the national bodies, so in the Congresses, and he had dwellings in both places. He grew up in both places, so he uniquely could understand, the sort of this relationship between the large states and the small states. And he was very, very concerned for his little state of Delaware that the big states, and especially the slave states, were going to, gain too much power, and they were going to impose their power on the small states, and they were maybe going to tax them. They were maybe going to, dominate their trade. And so he was very concerned about these issues, and so he was insistent that the small states not be just overtaken by the large states. So they couldn't have, everything could not be proportional as Madison wanted it.
Right.
There had to be equal representation in one branch. So anyway, Dickinson was the person who came along and said, all right, how about we have one branch represent the states and one branch represent the people? And they all went, no, whatever. And so Dickinson actually had over the weekend I'm off the top of my head, I'm not sure, it was in June.
Right. I can say sometime in June.
And it was in early June, and he prepared this speech on the New Jersey plan and the Virginia plan, and more or less just as he was starting to present his ideas, Alexander Hamilton jumped in, interrupted, derailed, and talked for the rest of the day, like 6 hours.
It sounds like Alexander Hamilton.
It kind of does. And so
was he mentioning how he wanted to have a monarchy? Because
well, no, he never did that, But yes, there's a reason it ended up being called the British Plan, and basically he harangued the convention for something like 6 hours, and then when he got done, like, nobody discussed it. Right. They just kind of went like, moving on.
Yeah.
And it was just so bad that no one was really going to touch it. And so, and then after that, he left. He didn't hang around for the whole convention. I don't know at what point exactly he left, but it was after that. And so then eventually, after they kicked stuff around for a while, they finally came back around to Dickinson's suggestion. But at that point, the Connecticut delegation, they basically built on what Dickinson had said, and then they get credit for it.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't love you taking the credit away from my buddy Roger Sherman, but I will accept your answer. And just to note, you were talking about the state within a state.
Hmm.
That actually ends up, we're reviewing on this channel the essays of Brutus, the Anti-Federalists, that would come around the following year, and that's a topic he comes back to a lot. Like, you're just going to
Hmm.
absorb the states. But I want to
Right.
follow up. You mentioned Dickinson leaves quite a bit early. Um,
Well, no, I haven't gotten to that point yet.
okay, well, it felt like we were
I
getting
said
there.
Hamilton left early.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were referencing Dickinson when you said that.
No, no. I mean, Dickinson left a little early, but only a few days, and
And
Hamilton left a lot early.
right, Hamilton returns though, if I'm not mistaken.
I think so. I'm
Yeah,
not entirely clear. I mean, in Dickinson, he had to go home for a little bit too. So I think in July he went home for a little bit and conducted business and came back.
yeah.
Um, but
You find that
but
kind of frequent. You find that frequently. Like I know
yeah,
William Blount went to New York City, signed the Northwest Ordinance, and came back to the Constitutional Convention. So,
right. I mean,
anyway,
they had lives and businesses and things.
right, exactly. So,
So
so are there any other contributions Dickinson made during that time period? Go
yeah,
ahead.
so that first instance with the representation, that's compromise in a positive sense. The large states and the small states had to agree, and they did, and so that was a good compromise. The bad compromise was where slavery was concerned. And this was one of Dickinson's other contributions. So and this is, it's a little hard because there's a lot of, sort of discussion back and forth. But basically, he was the person, he was one of the few people at the convention who took a moral stance against slavery. And he was the only one who had freed a large number of slaves. And by the time he'd freed all of his slaves, and then it was, eventually it was, providing them reparations. So, he had the most moral authority, and he was one of the few who actually spoke against. I mean, there were some slave owners who spoke out against slavery, but I mean, please, like, what are you supposed to think of that when they're saying like, oh, slavery is terrible, I hate it, oh, but I can't do, I mean, they weren't
Well,
going to free their slaves.
and not that I'm obviously trying to justify slavery, but when it's the core of the economy like that, it's in certain states it would certainly be tougher to eliminate than in other states. I will
Well,
note that. Like
sure,
that's why someone like Washington might have had to wait until their deathbed to free their slaves. Again, I'm not trying to justify or apologize for anything here. I'm just assessing the situation.
well, right, but Dickinson owned a plantation,
Right.
and he had a, certainly didn't have in the hundreds, but he had, we're not exactly sure, but it could have been as many as 60, and he lost. I mean, that was a sizable amount of money that he had to, in property that he gave up.
Right. And
But
I believe you've mentioned. Sorry to interrupt, but you've mentioned that he actually rewarded them. I want to say money. He gave them the ability to get on their feet.
yeah, I mean, he employed them,
Money's not the right
and
term.
charges. And he did provide reparations, like, for, especially, he was very concerned about the widows, elderly widows, and he would give them foodstuffs and dwellings, and when he charged rent, he would charge like $1 a year. I mean, something like just nominal. So he really tried to make sure that their lives, that they were taken care of after he freed them. He didn't just like free them and say like, okay, you're on your own. But in any case, he lost a good amount of money. I mean, I don't remember, it was something like 10,000 pounds,
Right.
Which was a huge amount. I mean, that was like massive amount of money. It was in the millions of dollars.
Right.
But he felt vindicated because after he freed the slaves and took that big loss, then his businesses got even better. So, look, I mean, yeah, sure, yes, slavery was, that's what the Southern economy rested on, sure enough. But there was no will, and there was no way. And the slave owners weren't about to even begin to gradually free their slaves. So in any case, Dickinson was the person who made the motion that the slaves ought to be freed. There was that they ought to be freed, and they were going back and forth. They're like, well, should it be 1800? Should it be later? And the compromise there was 1808, that slavery would then become the slave trade, not slavery per se,
Right.
but the slave trade would become would end in 1808. And so he made that motion, and what he wanted was that slavery should be, the word slavery should be used in that clause, that they would be ending slavery. And he said, we have to use that word, because if we don't use that word, it'll be we'll be accused of trying to hide what we're ashamed of. So he wanted the word used there, but it wasn't. They did not include, they approved his motion to abolish the slave trade, but they did not include the word slavery. On the other hand, for the fugitive slave clause in the Constitution, Madison and someone else who I'm forgetting right now wanted, maybe James Wilson, I think, wanted the word, persons legally owned. They wanted the word legal, or legally, to be in the fugitive slave clause. And it's pretty clear that Dickinson was the person who wanted that word legal or legally in describing enslaved persons, who would be caught by the fugitive, under the fugitive slave clause. He wanted that word legally removed from the language of the Constitution, and so that was another one of his contributions against slavery in the convention. And then there are a couple other contributions that he made. One was that he initially wanted a plural executive. He did not want a singular executive. And that's probably because of his experience in Pennsylvania and Delaware, where he was on an executive. When he was the president of those states, he was the head of an executive council. So I think he wanted to reproduce that at the federal level.
Well, that's interesting. I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's interesting because most of what I hear about Pennsylvania's Supreme Executive Council is it didn't work very well.
Right.
In fact,
right.
when people say that's a bad idea, they usually point.
And I think you're right about that. And I mean, he did not have an easy time as the head of the executive council. So, it's a little bit mysterious, but I think he was worried about the power. I mean, he was worried about, too much power being in the hands of the executive branch. And so, they obviously, the rest of the convention did not go for the plural executive. But the other thing he was very clear about, he wanted the president to be elected by the people.
Right.
He's very clear. He wanted a popularly elected president. He wanted the people to have as much say as they could. And so when that wasn't going to fly, he only very grudgingly agreed to the Electoral College. He did not like it. He wasn't happy with it. But he did agree to it as, when he couldn't get the popularly elected executive. So, I mean, he shouldn't. I've heard some people try to pin the Electoral College on him as something that he was pushing for, but that's not true. So anyway, he wanted the popularly elected executive. And then the last thing that I think is worth mentioning is the role of religion. And so, Dickinson was the only person in the convention who was very, very strongly influenced by Quakerism. And there were other religious people, to be sure. There were Congregationalists and there were Anglicans, or now Episcopalians. But I think it's pretty fair to say that Dickinson brought one of the most strongly held religious convictions to the body. I think, someone like Roger Sherman, certainly, coming from that background in Connecticut with, Congregationalism, certainly that was a very powerful influence. But, Dickinson was, he was living this faith and really embracing Quakerism like he never had before. He was, he freed his slaves. He was giving to these very sort of Quaker causes. He was building and buying or paying for schools all over the place, to educate poor children, to educate African American children. He donated funds to establish the first prison reform society in the Western world, and all kinds of things like that. And so, this, in a sense, it was his was in some ways kind of more traditional than the faith of some other people. He believed very strongly in the power of Christ, and that was very front and center in his mind, and the Bible. And so even though it was Quakerism, which is usually thought of as sort of a dissenting sect or denomination, it was in some ways more traditional than some other religions, like maybe say like deism or something.
Well, I was actually going to say that it's very interesting. It's another way he's forward thinking, because he's surrounded by a surprising amount of deists at the time, but this is just a handful of years before the Second Great Awakening. So
right. Well, but I mean, deism and evangelicalism were really opposed to one another. So they were really mortal enemies.
Well, that's what I mean. He's surrounded by deists, yet just a handful of years later, the revival would begin, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, of course, Quakers were not they were also, evangelicals drew very a lot from Quakerism, but Quakers did not necessarily approve of evangelicalism.
Yeah.
It was
I just meant in the moral, like using your religion as the moral guidance of your life aspect.
Sure, yeah, and yeah. So Dickinson was, someone who really brought religion with him into the convention, and it was very quintessentially, Quaker religion, and that's why we see his objection to slavery, and also I am pretty convinced that Dickinson was also using the Quaker meeting structure as a model for his federalism. So, because the Quaker meeting, it's governed by both regionally and by the calendar. So you have Philadelphia yearly meeting, which then encompasses regional quarterly meetings, and those are composed of monthly meetings, and they go by sort of like general region, then to the county level, and then to the city level, the town level. And then when Quakers expand enough and they go farther afield, they just establish a new yearly meeting and new quarterly meetings and monthly meetings. And so their governing structure just sort of expands like that. And so Dickinson had a model for a federal system kind of built into his thinking because of his religious upbringing.
That's fascinating.
So yeah, well, I think it's pretty interesting.
Dr. Jane, I could listen to you talk about John Dickinson for hours on end, but I think that's enough today. Thank you so much for coming. I assume you'll be back in the future. Thank you again.
I think so. Thank you so much.
Founder fans, again, that is Dr. Jane Calvert. She is, from my perspective, the authority on John Dickinson. Check out the links in the description below for all of her fantastic work. And make sure you hit like and subscribe for a new founder tomorrow.